Good morning. My name is Chuck DeVore, and I am Vice President of Policy at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I thank you all very much for attending this morning our Prosperity and Poverty Summit. I think we'll have a very interesting and fruitful day with two panels and a keynote about this very important topic. What we intend to do at the Texas Public Policy Foundation is that this event is not merely a one-off event. This is not some discrete, we've done our day on poverty and we're now moving on. This, in fact, is the beginning of a comprehensive effort to look at the nature of poverty in America and to determine how best to address it, how to reduce poverty in America. Now, it's very easy because of the material society in which we live to kind of follow down a path pioneered by the Marxists over 150 years ago, where they merely maintain that poverty is a material condition. It is a need for things that determines poverty, and certainly that is part of the equation. But some folks on the upcoming panels have very dynamic arguments that might suggest that a need or a material want is merely a symptom of something else, that poverty, in fact, is far deeper than a lack of bread. And that is one of the aspects that we'll be exploring. I heard at the breakfast this morning from Robert Woodson some very interesting challenges, which is that it's not enough to merely win the argument. It's not enough to develop more comprehensive ideas and plans, better data, to have a more logical presentation. But rather, the challenge is finding those individuals whom our policies would help and equipping them to advocate for their own position, for their benefit. And I think that if a few good things come out of this conference and the sustained effort afterwards, that's going to be one of those good things. So ladies and gentlemen, this, I believe, is some of our most important work at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, certainly some of the most important work for public policy officials, those people who are in both elected and appointed office, those people who work within administrations and bureaucracies. This is a vital question of human well-being. And to help us lead our first panel, we have delighted to have in from Grand Rapids, Michigan, Reverend Father Robert Sirico. And you're going to hear some dynamic discussion not only at this first panel that's going to be led by Father Sirico, but also you're going to enjoy his being the keynote for lunch. He is the president and co-founder of the Acton Institute and the pastor of the Sacred Heart of Jesus Parish, and both of those are, of course, in Grand Rapids. He's a regular writer and commentator on religious, political, economic, and social issues, writing for such papers as the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and many others. His most recent book, entitled Defending the Free Market, The Moral Case for a Free Economy, sets out how a free economy is the best way to meet society's material needs. But not only that, it's the surest protection of human dignity against the encroachments of government. And so certainly we would agree with the Father on that point about the importance of a vibrant free market in the role of human dignity and prosperity. So without any further ado, let's get this first panel started, and I'd like to turn it over to Reverend Sirico. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm really delighted to be here, but maybe I'm going to bring the skunk to the garden party by saying in full disclosure that with regard to the topic we are addressing, on this panel discussion, poverty and its causes, that I have a deep prejudice that you really don't have to dig very far to see what the cause of poverty is. All you need to do is sit here long enough and you will experience it. In other words, poverty is the natural state of the human race when it does nothing, or when it is prevented from doing something. And I hope that doesn't destroy all of the arguments that were forthcoming, because then we would have a very long coffee hour. But I suspect that with the esteemed panel that we have here, we're going to have many insights and a good conversation. Longer ago than I care to recall, I worked in your fair city of Austin for an entire summer. And I was a seminarian at the time. I worked at St. Austin's Catholic Church. And one day, two young, very well-coiffed co-eds came from across the street from the university in stiletto heels and just beautifully dressed and very fragrant. And they said, I was on duty, and they said, we wanted to talk to somebody because we saw this movie about the life of Mother Teresa, and we've learned about her life, and we decided that we wanted to go to India to work with the poor. Well, the first thought that came into my mind was that those stiletto heels were going to get caught in the cobblestones. But then I got to know them, and they were sincere enough, and I said, you know, to really minister to those who are in need, to the poor, you need to understand that the poor stink. Now, I once said this at a conference in New Zealand, and the headline in the newspaper the next day was that Father Sirico says the poor stink. And what I meant by that was, of course, actually, I guess I suppose I was anticipating Pope Francis's statement about the shepherd needs to be close enough to the sheep to smell like them. In other words, proximity, the question of proximity, the question of knowing people and knowing what their needs are, knowing what their condition is, authentically knowing it. So rather than shipping these ladies off to Calcutta, I brought them down. I don't even know if it's still operative, but there was a Hispanic diocesan food center that collects tons of food and then distributes it and brings it to people's homes. That was, I'm not really sure where we are right now, but somewhere in the central area, and handed them off to the deacon who was running the program, and I said, give them a good workout. I don't know if they ever made it to Calcutta, but it was one of the moments in my formation where I really was called upon to think about poverty and the way in which we middle class and upper middle class Americans tend to respond to it. I think that our panel will have some great insights into all of these matters, and so without further ado, I'm going to invite them to come. They will each have 10 to 12 minutes to speak, which will leave time for general dialogue. And Dr. Woodson, I know that you were not a minister, but you very often carry on like a Baptist preacher, which means I will be particularly severe with your timing. And there will be no altar calls at the end of your presentation, okay? I'm also not going to read the bios because you have them in front of you. I'm just going to introduce the speakers and their affiliation and then ask them to come and speak. So our first speaker this morning is the man immediately to my right, Richard Alm, who is with Southern Methodist University. Mr. Alm.
Good morning. I'm going to go a little bit away from where we were just talking about here and start looking at poverty in a very macroeconomic sense. I think it's very good to establish some of these big picture principles early on, and then my colleagues up here will begin talking about poverty on the individual and closer to home level. So I want to talk about, first off, poverty. One thing you have to understand about the world is there's great gaps in things. So this is consumption per capita all over the world. There's 40 countries there, 35, 30, I don't know, I never counted them. And if you look, if you just go back to the middle of the pack, United States, of course, on the far right, big one. Go back to the middle pack, you lose 70% of the value of consumption, and if you go all the way down, you lose 97%. So but one thing I'm going to stress is that there's huge gaps in between rich and poor. And so why is this? I'm going to give you one simple reason. The rich have capital and the poor don't. But I'm going to tell you I'm going to talk about 4 kinds of capital. The first is physical capital, which is the buildings, the machinery, and stuff like that. And the capital stock per capita, if you look around the world, the United States has per American $182,000 worth of capital. And I put this in there. This is a little digression, but it is one of the things you find out. We have a lot of capital. These are the numbers. But one of the things in the circle down there you'll see is that 75% of the capital in America is private capital, privately funded, private capital. The stuff owned by yourselves, business companies. So the huge capital advantage in America was built largely by the private sector. And of course, the private sector paid the taxes to fund the public sector's part. And of course, there's big gaps in the capital stock per capita around the world. So this huge diversion of capital is very prevalent. And if you look at consumption around the world, is that the capital and consumption go hand in hand. The more capital you get, the more consumption you get. And we did some fancy regressions around this notion of the capital stock and how it feeds into consumption. And it turns out that almost 80% of the differences in the capital stock in consumption have to do with the capital stock in countries. There's also a thing called financial capital. That's the money that banks have and banks lend and things like that, the financial markets. I'm not going to say too much about that. I think we're all pretty familiar with the fact that there's great gaps in that. And then there's human capital. Now, human capital is what you know that actually can help you earn an income. That's all capital is an asset that creates income. And income, of course, is the difference between rich and poor. Now, human capital is very hard to measure. But so the best they've been able to do is come up with years of schooling, which is quite dicey, I think. But since we really want to know what you know and not how long you sat in class. However, we do know that the more schooling you get, the higher your income, and that there are great gaps in the world. The United States is again towards the top in years of schooling, average years of schooling, and if you look around, you go all the way down to some of the countries in Africa have a year and a half of schooling on average. So now this is where, and everybody, I'm not, you didn't have to get up this morning to find out that physical capital, financial capital, and human capital have something to do with the difference between rich and poor. But I want to throw in a fourth bit of capital which we are calling freedom capital stock. And this is something that we've made up at the O'Neill Center, Dr. Michael Cox and I. And what it is it measures even if you throw a lot of physical capital, money, and education into a lousy system, you'll get a lot of poor people. So what you really need to do is throw those inputs into a good system, and that's how you can lift people out of poverty. So there's a guy I work with called Bob Lawson. There's an Economic Freedom of the World report, and these five things. We're actually able to measure how good a system is in terms of economic freedom. So what we do is, you see economic freedom, there's the United States, and we're fading. We used to be number 2 at 2000. So anyway, there's big difference. Anyway, so what we've done is our economic freedom in the United States has been fading. The rest of the world has been continuing since the mid-'80s, has been actually becoming more free, more capitalist, and closing the gap with the United States. So, now what's freedom capital stock? Well, freedom capital stock, you have to understand, is that 1 year's economic freedom is not going to do you much. What you need to do is keep in place a economic freedom over the longer term. The more you have, the longer you keep it, the more consistent you are with it. You build up over time this. It's like a capital stock. It's not something you're consuming every day. It's something you're building. So that's why we decided to call it the freedom capital stock. And the United States, because of its economic freedom, again, going back in the years prior to the start of the decline, is actually third in the world. And of course, there's big differences in the freedom capital stock. And so, if you look at the difference between freedom capital stock, you can see a lot of countries are gaining are building freedom capital stock, and the United States and 3 other countries are basically eating up their seed corn by reducing the. Okay, now I want to bring this down inside the United States so we can think a little bit about Texas. Physical capital, financial capital. There's no reason for me to believe that physical capital and financial capital are any different in Texas than the rest of the country. Now, fortunately, we do have a report that measures economic freedom on the state level, and so we do understand what economic freedom, which state has the right system into which to put these inputs in to create additional prosperity and reduce poverty. Again, this is the 2011, and Texas is 4th. But again, you have a lot of differences among states. That's New York at the bottom, if you want to sneer at somebody. Now, and when you put this all together, freedom capital stock looks over 40 years. And so if you look at Texas's freedom capital stock is very high, and it's way higher than New York. Now, this is the diagram we had before, except it's reversed, unfortunately. So people that are losing economic freedom, so a lot of states are losing economic freedom, becoming more dominated by government rather than markets. And Texas has sort of maintained its place. And that dot over there, the big SAR in recent is South Dakota. That's that thing that's not labeled there over to the right. So the other thing that is human capital. Is that Texas actually, I talked here in the spring, and if you adjust or most people see the thing on the left where Texas has low test scores, but if you adjust for demographics, you find Texas schools aren't doing so badly. So. But this is something that we can indeed have something to do with, and the solution, of course, is choice and competition. The forces of the market, move those into education, and we can, because what we're doing here is we're measuring the against the U.S. average, which again is low by world standards and below where we need to be. So we need to push the whole country up, and the United Texas with it. So. That's all I have time for. I was going to talk more about school choice, but we're out of time.
Perhaps, Mr. Alma, you can get those shots in on school choice during the discussion period. Our next speaker is Sandy Schultz, who works with work.
You're going next, right?
I was given this order. I have no dog in the fight, so. Okay, so Sandy Schultz, who works with Work Faith Connections.
You know, I've learned to have incredible trust that God has a perfect plan, and so he must have known that this would be the best order for things to be in. But anyway, what I want to talk about is we are here talking in terms of things that we think of as material poverty most often. And let me rephrase that. That's the thing we think of at the forefront of our minds. So we think of terms of lack of income, lack of housing, lack of health care, lack of food, lack of wealth. But the reality is poverty is poverty of relationship. And poverty of relationship not only exists in those people that don't have wealth, that don't have food, that don't have a place to live. Poverty of relationship exists in those of us that have everything the world would define as success. So before I kind of launch in, because I am going to talk about the poverty of relationship in that population of people that are lacking in income, housing, healthcare, food, and wealth. But I want us all on the same page, because as long as it's an us and them mentality, we will never address poverty in the correct way. And so poverty of relationship means you can have everything in the world that you thought was going to bring you happiness, success. But if you are lacking in hope, if you are lacking in gratitude, if you are lacking in a sense of purpose, you are living in a place of poverty. And you will feel just as disenfranchised as the person that is lacking in income, lacking in a place to live, lacking in resources. And so before we dive into this, I want us to be honest with ourselves. When we start looking at the solutions for poverty and how that will affect our nation, it is the poverty of hopelessness, the poverty of lack of purpose, and it is across the board. And if we want to make a difference in this country, we will begin to realize that the definition of poverty must be expanded, and we must address poverty across our entire country to turn this country around to be the great nation that it was born to be. And so I will address the things that I've been asked to address. But I have a bigger dream for this country, and I think every one of you sitting in this room has a bigger dream for this country. And so we'll talk about those where poverty surfaces itself as the way the American culture has defined it. And as a general broad population, those of you in this room are actually an enlightened group. Y'all actually know that it's a broader problem, and that's why you're here today. But we've got to deal that we have a whole country of people that we're trying to invite onto this journey with us, and we have to be real about what that picture looks like. And so even in the world of those who are materially poor, they think the reason they are poor is because they don't have the things that they see in the media, on the television. Often those in the materially poor will see their way out of poverty through a son who's got great athletic abilities that might lead them out of the way. And if that son gets killed in a gang fight one day, then their whole hope of how they were ever going to get out of that poverty just went away because they don't know the other paths that might exist for them. But really under the surface, so even in this country, and this isn't true in other countries, interestingly, but in this country, even those who are materially poor see that the reason they are poor is because they don't have the things that they see on our television and on all these media ways that paint a picture for them of what success looks like. Underneath what is happening is a feeling of inferiority. That happens with the materially rich as well. A feeling that our voice means nothing. Feeling of broken relationships, ashamed, degraded, and feel like I am nothing. And so how do we begin to travel a journey with men and women so that those underlying things that they don't even know are there can begin to come to the surface, and the shame that is keeping people separated from their potential and the opportunity can begin to be lifted? So I'm the president and CEO of the Work Faith Connection, and what the Work Faith Connection does is help men and women return to work. Many of the men and women that we serve have previously struggled with addiction, been in homeless shelters, been in prison. 60% of the people we help have felony convictions. A percentage of the people we help are willing to put their pride aside and come to the Work Faith Connection and say, I need the same help as these others. I've been struggling in job search for so long that I have lost confidence in who I am. And the Work Faith Connection comes alongside these men and women and helps them be reminded of who God created them to be and what they have to bring to this world. In essence, what I say to people is the men and women that come to the Work Faith Connection came at a point in time when their hope had been sucked out of them, that their future could exist and be better. And God just literally embraces them in such a way that they begin to see and be reunited with the dreams they once had in their life and the potential that exists for them. And so we start out by helping them return to work, and that's an important part of the process, but it's not enough. It does begin to put money in their bank account. It does begin to solve the things that they thought they needed from the work-faith connection. But it's the traveling the journey over a series of years relationally that begins to see these men and women turn their life around. You know, one of the things we were asked to talk about was where are some of the things that our society has in place to help the materially poor that actually work against them. And we had an interesting thing happen back when our economy fell apart, and that was that the unemployment benefit period of time was extended. And so what began to happen was we had men and women who did not want to look for a job because they needed to make, like they weren't going to take a $10 an hour, $11 an hour, $12 an hour job, because really to go back to work, they needed a $16 an hour job because now they were going to need to put their kids back in daycare. They were going to need to have expenses for gas to get to and from work. All these additional expenses would come into play. And so they didn't look for a job until their period of unemployment was almost up. What they didn't know were some of the unwritten rules that were going to affect them and the consequences of that decision. Now, mathematically, that was a good decision. But what ended up happening was now they're going back to work, and prospective employers are going, well, why haven't you worked for so long? Are you lazy? Will you really be a good employee for me? Is there really something about you that isn't showing on this application or resume that I need to know, and that's the reason you've been unemployed so long? And so there are things that get put into place that we think are going to help people that actually rob them of the future because they don't know what the unwritten rules are, the unspoken rules are that surround those consequences. The other things that we've seen with the men and women we serve, they often don't trust us when they first walk in the door of the work-faith connection. And because through these social service programs, they've begun to think that we think we're up here and they're down here and something's broken about them. And so there's not a lot of trust. There's just a desire to get from us what they think they need from us, which is a job. And so our greatest focus is on rebuilding the trust. You know, we celebrate the little things of progress, the beautiful details of change. And so one of the things that, we celebrate is when we hear somebody say, I didn't know what to expect when I came here. I didn't believe that somebody could really care about me as much as you care about me. I didn't believe that somebody would really be willing to travel this journey with me for 3 years, for 4 years, for 5 years. You see, when we first come into these men and women's life, they are not ready to embrace the totality of change that is necessary. So that length of relationship, that one-on-one trust, so that we are there in their life when those moments for change, we call them the teachable moments, when they're ready to embrace what God has for their next steps for the future. So in this brief little time that I have, I certainly can't tell you what we have learned from the men and women we serve over the last 8 years of the Work Faith Connections history, but I'd love to have the chance with each and every one of you to share with you the journey of how the men and women that I, quote, serve have changed my heart and my life, and to realize that when we come to this as equals with each other, that they have something to teach me and I have something to teach them, that is where poverty will be eliminated. And poverty is not just those that are lacking in material resources. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much, Sandy. You didn't seem ill-prepared at all for that. Alan Graham works with Mobile Loaves and Fishes.
It's awesome to be here. Mobile Loaves and Fishes operates in the space of the most chronically homeless people that we see on our street corners throughout all of our cities. And we believe very profoundly that the single greatest cause to homelessness is a profound catastrophic loss of family. And so I'm in total alignment with you, Sandy, and I'm glad you went before me because you really lay out what I believe is the way out of poverty in this country, and that is through relationship. The moral policy that it's going to take us to rebuild what has been collapsing over the past 3 generations is going to require a lot of dialogue and a lot of effort internally. The smell of poverty that Father talks about, we call the bouquet of Christ, because it is so critical to dive into the middle of this space. And it's a dirty, gritty, and it is oftentimes a very smelly environment. And I wrote down before Sandy ever got up there that policy without relationship leads to more poverty. This is a relational business. We can attempt to legislate our way out of everything that we see going on in the world today in terms of the people that we see on the street corners, the single parent households all day long, but unless we're willing to jump in, we're not going to be able to deal with this problem. I was asked to sit on a panel about a year ago for a movie that was produced called A Place at the Table. And it talks about the economic agricultural policy of the United States and how if we change that policy, that in effect is going to bring more nutritious food to the plates of the people that live in poverty today. And at the end of the movie, man, I was struggling with it in a big way. On round numbers, we think there's about 350 million people in the United States, and about 50 million are food insecure, whatever that means. So that means 300 million of us are food secure and 50 million of us are food insecure. I don't think any policy is going to change that, but if we start lopping off all the zeros, we end up with 30 secure people per every 5 insecure people. And we need to create a new movie. We need to create a new way called A Place at My Table. Can 30 of us in this room invite 5 food insecure people to our table? This is relationship, pure and simple. Now I want to talk about the dole. Can I have a show of hands of everybody in this room that lives on the dole? I believe that 100% of us in this room live on the dole. Nobody raised their hands. Now let me talk about what the dole means and then drill down into a comment that Father made that many times people that live in poverty are prevented from doing something, and this is what Sandy was alluding to on the unemployment deal. At the highest level of the dole in the United States of America could be companies like Exxon, and I'm not against the dole. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year lobbying for favorable treatment to be able to go out and do what Exxon does. And they create jobs, they create wealth. The market cap of that company is extraordinary. As we move on down the spectrum, we have our farmers in the United States. Many of them are on the dole. They actually receive money from the federal government not to farm, or they receive subsidies from the federal government to farm certain products that may not actually be good for us, but no problem with that. This is what we do in the United States. And the great thing about Exxon and the farmers is that they can receive these benefits from you and I as the government of the United States, and they can go out and they can create as much wealth. They can continue to do something that creates more wealth for them. And then we go down to what we typically consider the dole, and that is people that might live on SSI or SSDI, or people that might be receiving food stamps. And this is what drives me crazy. You can be declared disabled through a pretty arduous process and go out and receive a whopping $720 a month no matter what community you live in. But you are now prevented from earning one dime in 1099 or W-2 income. And I find that to be a crazy policy. And it's a policy that's been out there for years. I would rather have somebody that lives on the dole be out and continue to be productive to some level. And I think we need to look at that area of poverty, the food stamp poverty, the SSI, the SSDI area, and begin to rethink how we can continue to keep people productive. I believe that God calls us, as he does in Genesis chapter 2, verse 15, when after God created the Garden of Eden, he settled a man in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and care for it. He settled him in the Garden of Eden. Now, the Garden of Eden was a prepared blessing by God for you and I that we didn't earn and we didn't deserve. It's just a prepared blessing. And so I think that we can create a better Garden of Eden for all of our people here in the United States to be purposeful and to do something. Now let me talk about poverty a little bit. Man, we have the richest poor people on the face of the planet in the United States of America. And I think the way that we measure poverty in terms of this material side of things has gotten so egregious that we can no longer afford to sustain trying to keep people get out of this material poverty thing that we perceive exists out there. So we've actually developed something internally to Mobile Loaves and Fishes called a modest living income, an MLI. And we can get a chronically homeless individual off the streets, living in a gated community with running water, running sewer, trash collection, safety and security, and community, where they're earning $500 a month in total income. And they will be living somewhere around the top 15 or 20% of the world's population. Their shelter's covered, their food and clothing's covered. Now, I don't know if you realize this on the regulation side, and I love that slide that's got Texas towards the top of the deal. But let me tell you, in 80% of our communities today, including Austin, Texas, it's now against the law to have a lemonade stand on the street corner. I learned recently that Houston, Texas is the same way. These guys that are standing on the street corner holding a sign, turns out that that's a First Amendment free speech right to stand there and panhandle you and I on the street corners. But if I take a Yeti cooler full of 9-cent per bottled water from Costco so they can sell to you and I from the street corner, that's against the law. Code enforcement will show up, fine them $600, and take the Yeti and the water. I find that to be ridiculous. Mobile Loaves and Fishes is creating microeconomic business opportunities to try to block and tackle our way through the regulatory process. We're actually working with the city of Austin right now to amend ordinance that would allow people to be able to go out and sell some things on the street corner and be able to earn this modest living income that we talk about. I've actually written a blog post not too long ago entitled Panhandlers, the greatest yet most ineffective entrepreneurs I've ever met. And it's worth reading. It's worth reading. There's an entrepreneurial spirit out there, but we are preventing them from doing what it is that we would rather them do. And we have a statement about our chronically homeless individuals because we always want to scream through our tinted windshields of our automobiles to go get a job. But the reality is they are not W-2 employable, and they're not going to be. But they can be entrepreneurs. They are creative. There's a phrase that people often quote to Scripture that's not, and it says, we can give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day, or we can teach him how to fish and he'll fish for a lifetime. We have a saying that says, Our guys already know how to fish. How do we get them the license to fish? Thank you.
I warn you, Alan, I will steal that line for my homily on Sunday.
It's yours.
Thank you. Bob Woodson and I have known each other for a quarter of a century, I think, and you will be delighted by his remarks and his insight. He works, of course, with the Center for Neighborhood Entrepreneurship.
Good. Father mentioned that I am a Baptist. I grew up believing that any black is anything but a Baptist. Someone's been messing with him. So, but there's a prayer that I utter, and that is, God, give me the strength to tell and pursue the truth, especially when it's inconvenient to me. Because if you want to go someplace you haven't been, then you got to do something you haven't done. Or as my grassroots folks say, if you keep doing what you do, you keep getting what you got. And I really think it's important for us, looking at poverty, to move in an entirely different direction. And I agree that we need to, first of all, I believe that the principles that operate in our market economy should apply in our social economy. That's why we have the word enterprise in our name. And we know that in our market economy, we have to look at our market. It bothers me that we generalize about poor people. I agree. I found that there are 4 categories of poor people. There's category 1. These are people who just broke. They don't have any money, but their character's intact. It's a steel worker that the mills have closed down, can be retrained. Category 2 is the person who confronts disincentives to be independent. Like the mother in Milwaukee, Wisconsin some years ago that saved $5,000 of a welfare check to send her daughter to college, and she was prosecuted and charged with a felony. She concluded, well, I won't be thrifty anymore. Then you got category 4, people who are mentally or physically disabled. But category 4 is the one that concerns most of us, and that is people who are poor because of the chances that they take and the choices that they make. Theirs is a moral decision, crisis, and that cannot be confronted with money, because if you give it, you become an enabler. And so it seems to me that we've got to disaggregate that population. People on the left tend to look at all poor people as if they're category 1. People on the right tend to look at poor people as if they're all category 4. And that's why we keep missing one another when we're talking about remedies. It is the people in category 4 that concerns most of us, and I spend 100% of our time and the resources of our organization addressing poverty of those in category 4. And I must say that, again, applying the market principles, you must go into that community and begin to identify the healing agents or the social entrepreneurs that are indigenous to that community. Some years ago, Don and Rachel Warren at the University of Michigan did something that very few people do. They went into these low-income communities and queried the poor about where do you turn to in terms of trouble, in times of trouble and crisis. The first institutions that they turned to were friends, relatives, their local church. They were all institutions within the same geographical and cultural zip code as those experiencing the problem. The 7th institution they turned to were as an external professional service provider. So in light of that reality, we tend to deliver services to the institution of last choice of those in need and wonder why we fail. It isn't just government that designs programs for the poor by well-meaning professionals and then parachute those into those communities with the expectation that the poor participate, but 70 cents of every dollar goes not to the poor, but those who serve poor people. They ask what's solvable, not what's solvable, but what's fundable. So we have created a commodity out of poor people and wonder why we continue to fail. And so, but the solution then is not parachuting in even private sector. The issue isn't private versus public. I can tell you $100 million anti-poverty program by a foundation over 5 years, when they surveyed the kids they were supposed to help, they were worse off than they were before. The issue isn't private versus public, it's competent versus incompetent, effective versus ineffective solutions to the poor. And so what I'm proposing is that the social entrepreneurs, rather than coming into a low-income community and assuming there's nothing there until you showed up, it's important to go into those communities and ask people where do they turn to, and you will find that there are legitimate grassroots leaders who are social entrepreneurs who are already working on the problem in their community. The qualities that make them effective also makes them invisible. So before we come in to design remedies for people, we must try to first look at what's already there. Who are the social entrepreneurs? People that have made a long-term commitment to the people that they serve. And the reason that they have legitimacy is because they have earned the right to be critical of the people. Too many conservatives always emphasize what is wrong with the poor, what are obstacles, rather than what are victories. No one is motivated to follow you when you constantly remind them of injuries to be avoided. People are motivated to change when you give them victories that are possible. So, what we do is we go into communities and we look for these social entrepreneurs. Even though in our commercial entrepreneurs, only 3%, they generate 70% of the jobs. Well, I can tell you, by example, by going into these low-income communities, looking at something like violence. We know that there was 53 young gang deaths a year in Washington, D.C., 53 in the course of a year because of war and factions. There were 5 men that were trusted by the young people. We armed them with the resources to go in, and we brought the leaders of these warring factions together, mediated a settlement, and as a consequence of this mediation done by internal grassroots antibodies, they were able to stop fighting, and we put them to work rebuilding the community they tore up, with the result that all the gang deaths stopped. For 12 years, we didn't have a single gang death. And so what we did was take what these principles have done and applied it to different cities. In other words, we took what the marketplace does, take what's worked in one place, and then apply it elsewhere. But the agents of this transformation are the people suffering the problem. We must make the poor agents of their own transformation rather than delivering them from themselves. And so it is most important as we look at an anti-poverty strategy not to always impose. I did a video for your organization, and we talked, for example, about a spousal abuse center in Washington, where every year volunteers would collect toys and give them to the kids at the Christmas party. Everyone was happy except the mothers. So the executive director the second year all year enabled the mothers to work and earn toy vouchers. And the toys were then collected. And at Christmas time, the mothers shopped for their own children. At the Christmas party, they presented the toys to the children, and everybody was happy. In other words, we should stop requiring the poor to surrender their dignity as a condition of receiving help.
Yeah.
But we must also, rather than invest in interventions that are designed by people outside, we should go into the community and invest in those institutions that are going to be there long after we leave. Because the qualities that make these internal Josephs effective also renders them invisible. They're not whining and complaining. They're not looking for you. You've got to be like a Geiger counter and find them. But like entrepreneurs in our commercial marketplace, entrepreneurs tend to be very poor bookkeepers. Venture capitalists look for an honest entrepreneur, and what they bring are 2 things that we can bring: money, but also managerial expertise, so that something that starts in someone's garage ends up being a Fortune 500 company. We need to look at low-income leaders and organizations in these communities the same way. If someone can effectively help 50 children in unique ways and help them to overcome the crisis in their communities, then why don't we work alongside that person so they can help 500 children by funding their institutions in there, finding out what barriers they face, and then helping them to grow along a continuum, rather than always relying upon institutions coming from outside. So that's what I think we need to redesign. Last word is that we know in our market economy, in our social economy, we reward credentials. Certification is synonymous with qualification. But in our market economy, we reward results. We know that entrepreneurs tend to be C students, not A students. A students come back to universities and teach, C students endow. Because smart people have to have all the answers before they act, and when they act, the opportunity's gone. But so grassroots leaders are like that. They're social entrepreneurs. But we also know in our market economy, we reward people that produce things. In our social economy, we reward people who talk about doing things. And so it is important for us to make a difference, but we should go into, again, by summary, go into those communities, find out what's already working, find out whatever resources we have, like a venture capitalist, how can we apply what we have to help institutions within that community to grow and to heal themselves so that they can become agents of transformation. But the one thing that the poor need more than anything else is reciprocity. Good clients make very poor citizens. We know, as our other panelists said, we should expect to receive something in return for what we give, because that's the foundation of dignity and self-respect. Thank you.
Well, I do thank you all, because I now have homilies through Christmas. So I'm going to ask you to begin preparing some questions, please, questions or points of clarification or even debate, but not lectures. But I'll prime the pump by asking this question, and I'll use Dr. Woodson as a foil, but ask the other participants to kind of jump into this, because each in your own way have alluded to the importance of entrepreneurship, to freedom, to not holding people back, to the insights of the market. But you made a particularly provocative point when you said the problem isn't, this is for you, Dr. Woodson, the problem isn't private versus public, but competent versus incompetent. And, you know, obviously there's great truth to that, but is there something about politics, about central planning, about the very paradigm itself, that by its nature impedes prosperity and retains the mechanism of incompetency? Does it impede knowledge that a market, while people may be incompetent, they don't tend to exist as long as government programs who just end up throwing more money at the problem, the more it fails? So I'd ask you to respond to that, and then the others to
I think you must make a distinction between central control of government than demonizing like all government money. Anything that government spends money on that somehow, I think it's important to make that distinction. But no, I agree with you on central control. You're talking about a government function, not necessarily a government resource. So I would say to you there's a distinction between control, yes. As far as money is neutral to me. If it's used the right way, it's effective. If it doesn't, it's ineffective. I can sit here all day and tell you $100 million spent by the Annie E. Casey Foundation for 5 years into the cities, and the kids that they surveyed after 5 years of intervention were worse off than they were before they got started.
Would any of you like to chime in on that?
I'll make a comment. Work Faith Connection is a privately funded nonprofit, so we are supported primarily by successful business people in Houston and churches in Houston, and then some of the foundations in Houston. And so one of the things so we are not receiving any government funding, and that's not to say that there's not good in government funding, but to comment on your question, the statement that you made that I wrote down was it's often what happens in organizations that actually start out with very, very good motives. They start out with a motive of what is solvable, but they move to what is fundable. And that is something we have to pay very, very close attention to. And as I watch some of the partners that provide incredible job skills training, for example, for the graduates of the Work Faith Connection, and yet I see them going up to 72 employees and down to 26 employees as funding comes and goes and comes and goes. It's not a focus on how do we, and it's not that their heart wasn't there when they started. That's a really important thing to know. But something's not working right, because what ends up happening is we start focusing on what's fundable, not what's solvable, just in the way things are often set up right now.
Well, let me, this issue of competent versus incompetent, I think you always have to look at the incentives that are built into a system. In other words, a poverty agency could actually be very competent at achieving the incentives and goals it is, but the incentives and goals may not be reducing poverty per se. I think you see this in education. I think the stated goal is to teach students better, to have better educational outcomes, but the public school systems don't necessarily have the proper incentives, and the goals are not necessarily, so they're not necessarily working towards that goal and using the resources very effectively.
Alan, did you want to chime in?
I struggle a lot with the whole idea of solving something that's so ginormous. I'll be 59 here pretty soon, and been subjected all my life to many cure-a-thons and solve-a-thons, and here I am approaching 60, and there's not been much that's been cured or solved. Yet if we begin to look at this issue in a palliative way, that is, relieving the suffering associated with disease without pursuing the cure for that disease, we actually find maybe some of the greatest transformations we have in the medical industry in terms of palliative care, and I think that speaks a lot to the relationship side of the deal. How do we, and look, not working and not being purposeful is a suffering role in life, and how can we palliatively treat that? People want to be purposeful and valued and cared for. They want dignity in their life, and so I think if we look at it from a palliative point of view, we might have a greater curative impact.
I'd just like to stick my 2 cents in and say, I wonder if the question isn't government, non-government, but what level of government? And that is to say, isn't it much better to have those most proximate to the issue, as each of you in one way or another have demonstrated, who know what the real issues are, have the resources available to you, and only when a manifest failure exists on that local level, whether it's churches or extended families or mediating institutions, then go up to a city or a municipality and then remove, when the society itself is naturally functioning again, remove those subsidies and so that it doesn't become a substitute, but really a true subsidy in the true sense of that. We'll open it up now that we've stimulated the pot. And there are microphones, so please wait, because this is being broadcast and videotaped, so to get your voice on that, right there.
Thank you. I've heard lots of you make reference to, using market forces to help solve some of our issues. And so I want to ask a very specific question around housing, because in every major metropolitan area, and really even in mid-sized cities, and particularly in Texas right now with the oil boom, housing costs are being driven by the market to just astronomical rates. And the impact that this has on people, not just people that are very poor, but the impact that it has on people even middle class. is very concerning. And the organization that I direct does a lot of homelessness prevention. And so, you know, even if you took a magic wand and put it over all of the people that are really struggling and made them into quote-unquote perfect, totally functional people, the fact is that even if they were totally functional, they literally do not have access to an apartment unit that they can pay for. Even with our assistance, it's not there. So my question is, how do we use the market? Because there are lots of folks operating in the housing market to solve the housing, to create this dearth of affordable housing, this amount of affordable housing that we actually need. And how can we do that
Right.
without government assistance?
Let's direct that to our economist here, Mr. Alm.
Well, what should happen as housing prices rise, you should get a supply response. And I live in Dallas, they're building like crazy. Now, one of the problems, and this is particularly acute in California, is there's often a restriction on new housing supplies. So what we need to do is make sure that society, or government in particular, doesn't create a lot of restrictions and disincentives to new housing supply, because that's the only thing that's going to house more people without raising the price. Because if you don't have a supply response, you will not. The problem is only going to get worse. So the problem is, if it's a supply problem, you need to look at how to increase the supply. And one of the differences between California and, I think Mr. DeVore is going to tell you later, is housing prices are out of control in California because they systematically restrict supply. So what we do in Texas is we at least have fewer restrictions. In California, we probably still have a lot of restrictions on supply.
Another question. Right over here. I tend to kind of move around the room, so no one area. The left and the right are happy then.
Dr. Woodson, you talked about, you were just delving into the poor and reciprocity, and we never really heard your full thoughts on that.
On reciprocity? Yes. In other words, too much of aid to the poor treats them as if they're clients. Everything is directed toward them without expecting anything in response from them. And that's where you rob the person of dignity. We should have the highest expectation of people and not just give them things because they need it, but they should be given the opportunity to earn it and get rewarded as a consequence. That's all I'm saying.
Yes, over here in the center.
Having at various times in my life done a little bit of all of what you've been involved with, something I saw constantly, and right now with Kairos Prison Ministry or a drug clinic board I was in Chicago, the overwhelming majority of the people who we were trying to help and work with came from single-parent households. And I'm just going to pick on Chicago because that's where I lived 60 years, but it can be true of any big city. 80+% of the kids in the Chicago school system come from single-parent households, and the overwhelming majority of those are women who have never been married. And so you're at a spot where there's no male role models, often drug problems. The only male role models are gangbangers. And gee, we're surprised they end up in prison, where I then get to see them again for the Kairos ministry, or in the drug clinic, where I'd see them on the drug clinic board. How do we drill down, in my opinion, sort of the building block is family, and where do you start from there? And I used to find the people we had the most success helping were the ones who had a better family foundation, and the ones that really had the hardest time moving forward was that they had no one else to lean back on.
I suspect Sandy Schultz will have some insight into that.
At the Work-Faith Connection, we often say we become an interim family to the men and women that we're serving for that very reason that you said. If I was a single mom that my skill set only allowed me to make $9 an hour. And every time my child got sick at school, I had nobody in my family to call upon. I don't know how I would survive either. And so what our goal is to actually bring churches into relationship with the men and women coming to our program so that those church communities, those faith communities, can actually become that interim family. Those male role models can become into their lives. And so Work Faith Connection cannot do it alone, but the faith community coming into the lives of those men and women can. Absolutely.
And I'd like to give you an example of how this problem is being addressed internal to one of the most crime-ridden neighborhoods, where these young men I told you about had stopped fighting, and they were transformed from predators to ambassadors of peace. But when you ask them what they're passionate about being coaches. So we made them coaches, and they have a tremendous impact on the kids. They are surrogate fathers. So we have 4 coaches, 120 kids, 4 teams. And the coaches said, well, the kids will behave themselves when they're around us, but not around their moms or their teachers. So every week they require the kids to get a behavioral card signed by the teachers and the parents, or they can't practice. And both parents say they now have some control over the kids. So we've got to come up with creative remedies. We should be funding them full-time to work as coaches in these high crime areas because they're respected by the kids. They used to look at them as gangbangers and drug dealers, but now they're looking at them as coaches and fathers. We need to incentivize and provide institutional support for those kind of arrangements, building from the inside out. But we don't do that. We don't think about investing in these kind of unorthodox, unusual arrangements, but they're the ones that are chosen by the people suffering the problem. And they need help from the outside. Maybe some of those churches could come in and help them to build institutions, to find a facility to practice, or to provide the means for them to take the kids on a bus out of the city. In other words, why don't we use our resources to help people inside to do the things to reinforce those existing relationships rather than coming in as competitive to those relationships?
Yes.
I think trust is one of the biggest things that's gonna solve the entire issue. I have kind of an example. I was at a convenience store, and I was kind of traveling from Dallas to Houston, and I ended up talking with a lady that was working there, and we ended up talking about her wanting to get her GED, and then she went on break, she invited her daughter there, who also needed a GED, and I could not follow, I gave her a reference, I followed up as much as I could, and we built a trust together. That was great, but when I passed her off, I wasn't able, I contacted her again and emailed, and we kind of lost touch, and I don't know how to keep doing the follow through and how to, there's no list that I can carry in my pocket. It was Magnolia, Texas. It wasn't Houston. It wasn't Austin. It wasn't anywhere where I can, have people that I can trust, or I can actually have time in my day, since I have so much to do, to actually drive to Magnolia and introduce them to someone, because I'm the one who built the trust, and they trust me. And when I introduce them to someone, it's hard without making that personal connection to get them there and to get them to that next level. And then I think another thing, and I had an amazing family. I mean, I have great grandparents, great parents. I'm from a generation where when I have $5, I used to go and buy Cheetos and a Coke, and I didn't when I was younger, didn't think to save, and instead of that, do a banana, or save for those dollars, and kind of, just start to save and put money into maybe like an IRA or something like that. And I think the tools that we need to really implement at a young age, especially with children that are from single parent homes, and we can do this within the education department and really teach them these skills about saving and about bank. You can open a bank account and you can put $1 in there every week, and just give them incentives, and somehow put that into education. And so
Let me reformulate this question, because I think you're bringing up a really fundamental issue, and I'd be very interested in hearing how you all confront this. Time and time again, anyone who has worked in these kinds of areas or the experience that you have had is that while we're working with the person, they're responding. But when they're on their own, things begin to fall apart again. A, is that the case? B, does it reflect a more profound cultural issue that when one lacks an intact family, an expectation of stability, a vision for the future, the hope that Sandy spoke about, are we dealing with something, really enormous, that it is a wound at least part of this? No one thing is the silver bullet, I know, but are we dealing with a very, very deep wound here? In other words, should we start with pregnant mothers? You know what I mean? To form the culture from the beginning.
We are dealing with a very deep wound. That is absolutely true. What I'll tell you at the Work Faith Connection, our focus is to help men and women begin to see themselves, and Dr. Woodson alluded to it, as part of the solution. As they come to the Work Faith Connection, we tell them that God could have helped them get a job without bringing them to the Work Faith Connection. He brought them there to equip them to realize as He sends them out, He is sending them out to be a bright light of hope to other people that are discouraged, that don't know how to move ahead in their life. So we actually spend that time altering their perception of who they are to help them begin to see themselves as part of that solution as we send them into the workplace. But it's a journey. So I always say they're on this super happy spiritual high, and then the journey is no different than any of us. We have our ups where we're on track with our goal, and then we fall. And then hopefully somebody comes back into our life that reminds us where we were trying to go by asking us questions, not by telling us, by inspiring us, reminding us of the dreams we have so we grab hold of them again. That's what we have to do with these men and women, and understand it's a long journey, and not give up on people because they take a step in the wrong direction. We take steps in the wrong direction all the time.
May I just, in these last minutes, make a recommendation for this think tank and others? And that is, we really need to redefine what we mean by expert. I would go to 10 women, Father Sirica, who successfully sustained transformation and redemption, and bring them to a conference and let them explain to us how they were able to sustain what they did over time. I can introduce you to 15 young adults who went to college when all 3 years they were in a homeless shelter and or living in a car. And these two sisters graduated valedictorian and salutatorian and started as sophomores to college. They are the experts about how do you overcome poverty. Why don't we see them reflected in our scholarly journals? Why don't we go to 30 or 40 people that have been redeemed from single-parent households where the mother's in jail, but they were able to overcome this bad start? Why don't we ask them how they did it? What resources did they need? What can we do to produce more people like them? Instead of always going into the 70% of the households that are raising children that are dropping out of school in jail and drugs, why don't we go to the 30% that are not raising children that are dysfunctional? They are the real experts. Let's write journal articles about what is it that defined their success, and then what kind of help can we provide so that the 30% can influence the 70%. That's an anti-poverty agenda. That's what's forward-thinking. That's what's going to recruit people to conservative principles. We must demonstrate that conservative principles have the consequence of dramatically improving a person's life. Then people will support us.
I warned you he was going to try and do an altar call, didn't I? But it ended on exactly the right note, because the next panel confronts exactly this question, from poverty to prosperity. And that will take place in this room in about 15 minutes. So you can refill your coffee cups, unless you're Mormon, and then you can have a glass of tepid water or whatever. And if you're Catholic, you can take your smoking break out front, and we'll see you back here in 15 minutes.